Thank you. As you know, my name is Choi Gang, Vice President. I'm very much pleased and honored to chair this session. As you can see, this is a real global forum because actually we have representation of all major countries, also including Germany. So it's my privilege to have, especially Mr. Chon Hae-sung. He's a good friend of mine for past almost 15 years. We worked together at the Blue House. We endured very demanding times over there. So I'd like to ask Mr. Chon Hae-sung to speak about 10 minutes, and then he will be followed by each speaker, because actually you can make some comments on Mr. Chon's points, and also you can raise a question, also maybe with each other. So I'd like to have each country's maybe your own understanding of your country's perspective, understanding on this trust-building process on the Korean Peninsula. But actually you can expand further, because actually the Minister Yoo Gil-jae already mentioned is connected with the peace and stability in Northeast Asia as well as global. So I think that we can cover not only the Korean issue, but also a little bit regional as well as global issues in conjunction with the peace trust-building process on the Korean Peninsula. So without further ado, let me ask Mr. Chon Hae-sung to make his presentation, please.
네, 예, 방금 소개받은 전혜성입니다. 제가 말씀드리기 전에 먼저
my name is Chon Hae-sung. Before I begin my presentation, I'd like to thank the Asan Institute for Policy Studies for hosting this wonderful forum. So on behalf of the Ministry of Unification, I'd like to thank the organizer. As was introduced, I will speak for the next 10 minutes about the trust-building process in the Korean Peninsula, which is the current government's policy towards North Korea. As Dr. Choi Gang said earlier, the keynote speech by the Minister of Unification pointed out the key aspects of the Korean Peninsula trust-building processes. So what I'd like to do, taking this opportunity, is to focus on some of the policy issues in more practical terms and the development so far. And looking ahead in 2014 and onwards, and I'd like to share with you our future direction. And I'd like to seek your opinions. As you know, Korea went through the division and the civil war, and the inter-Korean relationship experienced some progress, but also the history was experienced some confrontations and conflicts. So with the inauguration of this Park Geun-hye administration, it has been about a year, then we make a evaluation or assessment of our progress so far. In looking at the achievement for the past 10 months or so, then we'd like to make the best use of our achievement, because the North Korean policy, that symbolizes the domestic or internal conflict. So our aspiration and hope is to make our North Korean policy to be something that engages everyone, that pursues integration, meaning that the current inter-Korean situation, well, if I may summarize, the heart of the problem is that the loss of trust. I believe that that can be pointed out as the main cause of many of the problems, because we might have had some discussions, some progress, but there were not enough to build any outstanding trust relationship. So through such trust, that we could improve the inter-Korean relationship, and through that we could resolve the tension and conflict in the Korean Peninsula, and therefore laying a strong foundation for peaceful unification. So that is our future direction. And with that said, for the past 10 months, as was mentioned by our minister, then we have pursued our North Korean policy. Looking back, starting from last December, North Korea conducted its third nuclear test, and they shut down on the Kaesong industrial complex. So there has been a numerous provocation and even the threat of war. So we were faced with numerous challenges and threats. So towards such provocation, then we were faced with unwavering response, and we were very firm in terms of our stance and response. And I believe that that is one of the important factors in the trust building process. But as you know, since May this year, in the Korean Peninsula and between the two Koreas, we have come to a different phase of relationship, different phase of dialogue, because the Kaesong industrial complex started to be reopened, and there's been the more open dialogue. So we have been rather flexible in managing the inter-Korea relationship, and it is not just the management of the relationship, it is more of a problem solving or the resolution of the existing problems. So flexibility, flexible response, I believe that is another important axis or another important factor for the trust building process, meaning that we stand strong and firm against the provocation, but at the same time, we remain flexible towards any positive and welcoming development within the North Korean regime. So we are trying very hard to strike the fine balance, intricate balance between these two. So during the process, well, of course, you might well know that as of now, and especially starting from the September 21st, the North Korea agreed initially to let the separated families to reunite, but they have postponed such reunification. So starting from the September this year, the inter-Korea relationship came to another rounds of cold phase, and there was an outward criticism towards the national leaders and some of the more prominent political figures within South Korea. But we remain rather consistent in terms of our response and try to keep calm and remain calm in terms of selecting our responses to any such provocation. So the Korean Peninsula peace trust building process is all about maintaining our core foundation to seek any short-term gains. But it does not mean that we won't be flexible, because when the time demands, then we have to be and we will be flexible. So I have shared with you some of the experiences that the ministry went through for the past months. And I understand that recently there has been very active discussions and coordination among the countries that would be affected by any further development of the North Korean nuclear situation. And it has been a very firm situation, the position of the government, that we will not allow, and we do not allow any nuclear ambition of North Korea. And that is the position. But at the same time, we work very actively by working with all the related authorities of the related countries. But so far, the North Korea's behavior towards its nuclear ambition or this nuclear development program, it does not warranty our trust, because it is a time for North Korea to demonstrate its intention with action, not just with words. Maybe a promise that deserves further trust. In terms of managing the inter-Korea relationship, it might require some humanitarian exchange or the private level exchange. Then we will continue to promote that. As you might know, that with the Korea-Russia summit, there was an MOU signed on the Asan project, and The interest has been shown by some of the Korean companies. Of course, it is still at the MOU phase, so we will have to wait for some time before we know more of the details of how this MOU will be implemented in reality. But as was shown in this process, that the Korean government will continue to make efforts in providing all the necessary humanitarian efforts before the thawing of the inter-Korean relationship. So there are two aspects that the Korean government is considering. The first is that the trust building process will be maintained with consistency. Consistency is the key word. During the keynote speech provided by our minister, the consistency has been mentioned a number of times. Then we will be focused, and we believe that we will be faced with a number of provocations and challenges and threats, but with a strong support from our allies and the neighboring countries, then we will remain focused and unwavering in our position. And one of our policy directions that the current administration has is to lay a strong foundation for peaceful unification. So we will also exert all the related necessary efforts to lay a strong foundation for a future peaceful unification. And it has been mentioned or covered in the local media, citing survey on our Korean population on the necessity of reunification, and especially amongst the younger generation. The younger generation are not necessarily aware or in favor of reunification, and we are very much concerned about the situation. That means that we will have to strengthen our efforts to conduct the training and education on the issue of unification, and we want to maintain the strong zeal and efforts amongst the Korean people for a peaceful unification. So that will be a very important part of us laying the foundation for a peaceful unification. So in this regard, it is a great opportunity for me to listen to the expert opinions from the other country experts. So that concludes my short talk. Thank you.
Before I ask my friend Shulong mention about it, I have two specific questions. At the last part of your presentation, you asked us 평화 통일 기반 구축, the consolidating the base for peaceful unification. Could you be more specific? What kinds of the base or conditions for peaceful unification you have in mind beyond the national consensus among the people? Second, actually, I was wondering about this. You already mentioned the Park Geun-hye administration is trying to improve or enhance inter-Korean relation on the cooperation and assistance or other things. So there's one problem with that. The previous administration imposed a sanction on North Korea on May 21st, 2010. Whether it's possible for Park Geun-hye administration to lift up the sanction to enhance or expand the cooperation between the two Koreas in those areas you mentioned. So that's a quite sensitive issue, because actually we have not got any apology or recognition that of Cheonwon-ham incident and also the Yeonpyeong-do. So Yeonpyeong-do came later, but Cheonwon-ham was the one. So I have been wondering that. One final question, you mentioned about the balance between the firm principled approach and also flexibility. In word is quite fascinating. Everybody will support that. In practice, it's quite difficult to make a balance between these two. So maybe we can go for a little more strong approach than the flexibility at this point of time. So I wonder, can you be more specific what kinds of balance you have in mind? Now, I'd like to ask my friend Chu Shulong for his Chinese perspective on the trust building process. Okay.
Okay, thank you. First, I think President Park proposal or strategy or trust building on Korea Peninsula, I think it touched on real fundamental issue within the Korean relation, or relations between any two people, or any two parts, or any two countries. This is root reason issues. So I see this is really hit the point, issue. And I know little about the inter-Korean relations. So perhaps what I can do is to reveal how the two sides across the Taiwan Strait in China building their trust. Because this is not a divided nation in Northeast Asia. Might be some are relevant to Korea trust building. And the two parts in China did not have trust for 6 decades, 60 years, since 1949 when they were divided, when PRC, People's Republic of China, was founded, and the Kuomintang government withdrew to Taiwan Island. And during the 40 years, from 1949 to 1988, when Jiang Jingguo died, both sides want to reunification. Both sides committed to national reunification, but they were enemy to each other. There was not only, not at all trust between them, but because each side seek their called unilateral unification. That unification by one side win, and the other side lost. Is also called a zero-sum game, reunification. So there was no any trust between them. And after Chiang Kai-shek and Jiang Jingguo died, and the Li Denghui took place, Chen Shui-bian took place. So over the 20 years since 1988 to 2008, and Taiwan virtually pursuing independent movement. And not only distrust between two sides across Taiwan Strait, but the crisis and a couple of crises, including 1994. But since 2008, when KMT, National Party, Mr. Ma Ying-jeou took power again in Taiwan, now over the past 6 years, there was a good trust between two societies, two governments. So Taiwan situation become quiet, stable. So how did we come here from there? The process over the 60 years, I see 3 are important issues of building trust across the Taiwan Strait in China. To building trust we have today. First, when two parties building trust, they must have some common final goal, or at least this is not a conflicting final goal. Here, across the Taiwan Strait, mainland still wants reunification. This is Korea. And the Taiwan current government does not say they want to reunification, but at least they recognize one China. And both Taiwan and the mainland are parts of the one China. So-called 1992 consensus has been the foundation for the mutual trust between two sides across Taiwan Strait. And for reunification, Ma Ying-jeou, Taiwan did not say, but at least they do not do something for Taiwan independence. Let to be sure. For future, because Taiwan is elected society, the ruling parties cannot decide the future. So they are hesitated to be clear about final reunification, but they committed now Taiwan independence. So there's a certain common goal, background between two sides called Taiwan Strait. So they have a fundamental trust with each other about the current situation, principle, consensus, and the future direction. Second, they have a common agenda. If two parties have try to building their trust, or have they must have a common or similar agenda or priority. And the two sides of Taiwan Strait have had the same over more than 20 years. That is economic development. That is a priority of mainland China since 1978. It's a solid priority of Taiwan over decades. So that is a common interest, common background. Both of them want to develop their economy, then they need a cooperation between two sides. So the economic development common agenda united the two sides across Taiwan Strait, put them together. So now you see over 20 years, the Taiwan economy is very much closely integrated to mainland economy. And mainland economy in the past 30 years rising depend very much on Taiwan economic investment and trade and technology. So in Northeast Asia, there are two economies that integrated with mainland economy very much. Almost 1/4, 25%. Right? One is South Korea, the other is Taiwan. And more than 1/4 economic activity tied with mainland economy. So there's already a common economic interest ground agenda for two sides to trust each other. Third, building trust through a mass intensive social economic context. Tourist visits, marriage, students exchange, culture exchange. Over the past 20 years, you see the intensive two-way travel from each year now, there are about 4 million trips across the Taiwan Strait. Half from mainland to Taiwan, half from Taiwan to mainland. Student exchange, friendly relations between people of the two societies. So when we build a trust, it's not just the business of government or politics, it's a social culture. Here, I'm so pity to see that there's not such a thing between two Koreans, that people to people friendly. Over years, even we were hostile with each other in politics. And we Chinese met together, no matter it's in Japan or in Hong Kong or in US, we immediately feel friendly, make a joke with each other. But such phenomena are never seen between North Korean students and South Korean students in China or in US. Never see them are together. They were together, or talking with each other, or have dinner with each other, or sing karaoke with each other. So I think we need some personal friendship, trust building between two peoples or two parties on Korea Peninsula as a trust building process. Thank you.
Thank you. I see that you actually carry some corresponding points which were made by Minister this morning about his cultural approach for the unification.
Yeah.
But what actually interests me is like about the status quo, kind of like the peaceful coexistence comes first, then the unification. But actually, Minister, you did not say anything about the peaceful coexistence for time, about the unification. So how North Korea perceives the South Korea desire to have a unification is going to be quite critical one. On that, I think maybe we can ask Mr. Chan to respond on that question. About the common agenda thing, like of course, the Minister, you already mentioned the things we want to do it. But whether there's a real, we have no idea what North Korea really wants from the outside world. Do they want economic cooperation with outside the world, or what kinds of system? The other point is that, for example, that the relation over the years between Taiwan and mainland China was that there's a political leadership change, which is also accompanied by this policy change. Whether it's possible to see that kinds of things within the context of Korean Peninsula. That's a point I can think that's related to Mr. Chan. Now I'd like to invite Professor David Kang for U.S. position, or David Kang's position on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there are many people in this audience who would quickly disavow my views as the official U.S. view. That is clearly not the case. So I can't speak for the U.S. government. I think in general, I will say a couple things about what I see how the U.S. is doing, and then I'll give you some of my own thoughts. I think the U.S. view is sort of tired. And so strategic patience is the only game that I hear in Washington. I don't think there's any desire on the part of anyone in the administration or in the policy making to try anything new. They've tried too many things. Everybody's just tired of North Korea. But I also get the sense, actually very clearly articulated, that the U.S. is not going to at all get in the way of a South Korean attempts to engage in creative thinking on North Korea, and in fact is very supportive of it. But I don't think the U.S. will be out in front on any of these things. But that's my view from the outside of the official view. And I think I can be more interesting if I give you the non-official view anyway. So I'm just going to make a couple points about trust politique. And the first one, I mean, it's come a lot here about Pyeonghwa Tongyeo and all these different kind of things. In international relations, and I will not be too abstract, but those of us who study international relations as a scholarship, it's very easy, and those of us who do policy, it's really easy to talk about power and coercion. No one will criticize you if you say we have to be tough. It seems very sober and hard-headed. The world is a dangerous place. So that tends to dominate the way that we think about things, and that tends to dominate the way we talk about things. But we all know that that's not the only way we get people or countries to do things, through coercion. In fact, in all the other social sciences, psychology, sociology, we know that there's coercion. How do you get someone to do something? You coerce them. You can bribe them. Perhaps most importantly, though, you can convince them. You can persuade them. Anybody who has a child, for example, or coaches a team or teaches whatever else, we don't only punish. We have rewards, and you have to convince them what you want them to do. And what I think Park Geun-hye has done most successfully, and I am not being paid by the South Korean government, but is to change the way that we're talking about approaching North Korea. This phrase, trust politique, in and of itself, forced all of us, this is why we're having this kind of a conversation, to widen how we think about the various tools that we use to interact with North Korea. Which doesn't mean abandoning any of the other ones. It doesn't mean losing our deterrent, as the official ministers and as many people have said here, it doesn't mean not deterring North Korea or not responding to provocations. But it moves the conversation beyond that in a way I think is very fruitful. Because you don't normally get countries to just do things by threatening them. And in fact, I would submit that we have a lot of evidence with North Korea that coercion doesn't really work. And I'll give you my private view. I think that threatening more on North Korea is highly unlikely to get them to get rid of their nuclear weapons. I just don't think that's going to work. So how do you look for other options? And I think one is this trust building. And let me talk a little more broadly about that. Because we're in the same place that we were on the security front with North Korea, essentially that we were in 1953, 60 years ago. The DMZ is the same. We're deterring. Everybody knows how to play the Cold War game. That hasn't changed at all. But when we look at North Korea, what I think most of us would agree is that what has changed are things that are actually not directly related to that. Business in North Korea and society in North Korea has actually changed quite a bit. It's nowhere near where we'd like it to be in terms of openness, and that's why we have all these discussions about what do they mean, are they serious, are they not? But it's also pretty clear that the border between North Korea and China is far more penetrated today than it was 10 years ago. And that there are far more interactions of DVDs and ideas than there were before. And that North Korea has changed. It just hasn't changed its security or its regime dynamics. Now, the interesting thing about this is most of the discussion that we've heard from the ministers, from the speech at lunch, of course deal with government actions that South Korea can take. I think South Korea can change the atmospherics or the framing of how North Korea, how we think about North Korea. But what I find interesting is many of those things that have changed in North Korea are not a result of conscious North Korean regime decisions. In fact, they're often responding to the way their own society is changing. Sometimes because they're literally going to die of famine, so they start to go in search of markets. Others simply because they can't control the provinces the way they used to. So I don't have any specific policy suggestions about trust politique. But it strikes me that no matter what, because yes, I'm very pessimistic about whether we're going to have some grand bargain in the next 5 years. I mean, I'm not holding my breath. But there are things that are changing, and I do think that the Pakane policy of trust politique and the general approach that can say we can still deter, but let's see how much we can get to change, may fit into the 3-decade-long plan where I'm looking around for Professor Wong, which it probably will be. It'll be 30 years. And if we have that long-term focus on changing North Korea, it may actually change in a much more slow, gradual way. And we won't have a big collapse of the Berlin Wall. But if North Korea's society is changing today, and has changed in the last 10 years, I think that this type of an approach that encourages the next 10 years for North Korean society to change more and to be that much more open to the outside world has a lot more possibility for ultimately, who knows, affecting the way the regime views itself and the outside world. I don't think it's a cure-all, but I would remind all of us that that's what's changed, and the security issue hasn't changed. So I will just stop there and look forward to.
So you are looking for the rather long-term approach in dealing with North Korea. So does that include a regime transformation? That's the first question I'd like to ask you.
I can answer, but I will.
Okay.
I'll put it off.
And then the other aspect, like now that we are talking about this trilateral cooperation between Korea, U.S., and China in dealing with North Korean problem, do you see the bright perspective for that? That's first. And what your own take on the Chinese policy toward North Korea? For example, when we had the Sunderland summit between President Obama and President Xi Jinping, everyone said, oh, China is on the same page with us. Whether that's the case as of today, or do you see any change over the past couple of months? So that's the second question. So it seems to me that there is a growing dimension of a U.S.-China factor in discussing or in dealing with North Korea challenges. So that's now I'd like to invite Dr. Mikheyev for your
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me make 2 short comments on what my Chinese and American colleagues said. First, I do not see similarities between China-Taiwan relations today and South-North Korea relations in regard to trust. Why? Because when China became market and open reforms, it made a basis for trust. So now North Korea has no market and open reforms. So North Korea-South Korean relations now seems to me similar to China-Taiwan relations, but not nowadays, but before China started the reforms. And second comment, what are differences between Cold War times and now in multilateral relations on the Korean Peninsula? At that time, Russia and China had security treaties with North Korea, so they were on North Korean side. South Korea, together with Japan and United States, was on the other side. Now the situation changed. First, Russia changed. It's a market democracy, okay, with our problems. China changed. It's on the way to market democracy in its, with its own speed. Russia doesn't have security treaty with North Korea. China, as I understand it, will not defend North Korea according to China, North Korean security treaty if North Korea starts the war. So, and finally, Russia, China, and the United States as responsible nuclear powers are absolutely against North Korean nuclear program. So the situation changed greatly. Now, on the trust building, Russian position is very simple. Build trust if you can. My position, if I talk about my position, I think it's interesting to try to answer a few questions. How North Korean leaders perceive trust in regard to South Korea? Is it possible to have trust with the current North Korean regime? What trust means for North Korean people? So North Korean leaders perceive South Korea in 2 dimensions. First, hostile enemy. National security law enforced US-South Korean alliance enforce no security alliance between North Korea and Russia. So enemy, no trust. Second dimension, South Korea is a source of money and economic aid. The less are relations with China, the more demand for economic aid. But it's not trust, it's a deal. Promise to be good in exchange for aid. There is no trust, second point, next point, there is no trust inside North Korean political elite. Politicians are afraid of Kim Jong-un's tough anger. We know many examples of it. And politicians in North Korea under Kim Jong-un fight each other for more strong positions in Kim Jong-un's regime. No trust inside, no trust towards outside. As well, Kim Il-sung, after coup attempt in 1958, the Soviet Union backed it. Kim Jong-il, after domestic political struggle with his aunts and uncles in 1970s, do not trust anybody, neither Russia nor China, sure not to US or South Korea. Kim Jong-un follows this strategic, good student. So, no trust. One thing more. Is it possible to trust to North Korea? Nuke development, negotiations practice, promise, get money, do nothing. They want to sell their nuclear weapons program. Now it's more difficult because of change of American and South Korean approach, but they want to sell it many, many times, but never sell forever. So on the level of the regime, on the top level, I think the trust policy is impossible. However, North Korean people, including those low and middle level bureaucrats, security, scholars, traders, etc., who have access to information about South Korea can trust. They can trust to South Korean goods, DVD, films, to South Korean living standards. Similar how East Germans trusted to West German style of life. They did not want unification, they wanted to live in West Germany. How people in the former Soviet Union trusted the US style of life that was one of the basis of the collapse of the Soviet system. So, in despite of that, trust is impossible, trust policy is possible. In my view, firstly, it could be aimed at small steps, small projects, people-to-people contacts, if possible, etc. Secondly, it could be a cover for engagement policy aimed at engaging as more as possible North Koreans into contacts with South Koreans. So to give North Koreans more information about South Korean style of life and business style. North Koreans can trust to it. And the final goal, it can be aimed at change of minds in North Korea, dissolution of ideological and political system, and finally, peaceful regime change in the direction of market and openness. Here we see similarities with American strategy towards the Soviet Union on the eve of the collapse of the USSR. Engagement policy worked in regard to the Soviet Union, and that finally led to the collapse of the Soviet system. So I think that trust policy is possible, but there should be a very clear understanding what are the final goals of this policy. Otherwise, if there are no clear understanding, it will be a policy of ups and downs. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mikhaev. So I think that Mr. Chon Hae-sung has to respond to his question about the difficulties ahead of us in realizing trust politic. But actually he mentioned about the rather long-term approach by engaging North Korean people and bringing about some gradual transformation of society like that. But also I like Professor Chu Shih-long's response about the Mikhaev's point as the analogy between Taiwan-China relations and this inter-Korean relations, because actually I like to have that one. Okay, now I'd like to invite Mr. Richter for his comments.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much to the organizers of Korea Global Forum for inviting me. So thank you to the Asian Institute and the Ministry for Unification. It's a great honor for me to be here and to share some ideas on the European and the German case. I have to underline as well that I'm not the official representative of the European Union or of Europe or of Germany. So what I would like to say, what I would like to share with you are my views or my positions as the representative of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom here based in Seoul. So allow me probably 2 remarks on my institutional background. So I have I think a more practical approach to the question. So I'm not stand for a university, but more or less for an NGO or a non-profit organization. So that's why probably it's a little bit more practical. And since since we are a German liberal foundation, so a foundation which is very close to the liberal ideology, I would like to stress or would like to have 2 focal issues. The one is the trust politic under an economic aspect, and the second is the German or the European experience with trust policy, Ostpolitik, and so on and so forth. I prepared a paper, so I think I will handle that very flexible, so I won't read it one-to-one. Probably first of all, when it comes to the trust policy here in South Korea, one of the key elements of President Park Geun-hye's trust policy is, as far as I see it, that North Korea has to respect international standards and norms, otherwise it's had to pay a penalty for broken promises. During this year's closure of the Kaesong Industrial Park, South Korea pursues a policy of credible deterrence against breaches of agreement, while leaving open the possibility for constructive cooperation. In the Kaesong case, this tragedy seemed, in my position or my opinion, seemed to be successful. After 4 months, everyone knows that after 4 months of shutdown, Pyongyang eventually agreed to the reopening of the joint industrial zone. But again, we saw that politics on the Korean Peninsula often go 1 step forward and 1 or sometimes, unfortunately, 2 steps back. So, to recall that, North Korea has cancelled the stipulated family reunions, whereas Seoul has postponed an event to attract foreign investors to Kaesong. So, trust policy, we have to have that in mind. Trust politic may work, but it takes time to build trust, and setbacks often are inevitable. What is Seoul's intention? As far as I can see, that South Korea aims to create a political environment that induces a change of North Korea. Additionally, the country seems to press North Korea so that it has no other choice but to change. But a less hostile and more cooperative relationship cannot be forced upon North Korea. North Korea can be encouraged but not coerced to make the right decisions. Trust politic will only work if North Korea also want to improve relations with the South. That was a short discussion in the morning after the keynote speech of the ministry. There came up the question, okay, we talked on unification, but what about North Korea? Do they want unification or reunification? However, North Korea, in all likelihood, does want improved relations for its own strategic reasons. Pyongyang needs to improve the economic situation. That's something Kim Jong-un has stressed several times. His legitimacy simply depends on it. So whenever I was in Pyongyang this year twice, I mean, whoever know Pyongyang or was in Pyongyang, they normally quote this quotation, this sentence. Kim Jong-un gave a speech on the occasion of the 100th birthday of his grandfather, April 2012, and he said this sentence: "No one had to tighten the belt." So, and this is a quotation everywhere and by everyone in Pyongyang. So, coming back to Kaesong, to the example of to the case of Kaesong. The implementing of the agreement made on August 14 saw some setbacks, unfortunately. Nevertheless, the reopening of Kaesong and the plan to create more special economic zones indicate that North Korea is serious about improving its economy. Another major reason for that is it has to become less dependent on China. That was a topic in the morning as well. The keyword is diversification when it comes to economy. This is something they they tell you all the time, diversification. So this is a this is the heart, the core of their, let's call it economic concept. Therefore, North Korea aims to attract more foreign investments from other countries. The question now is, should that be supported? This is a question for an institution like ours, Naumann Foundation. We depend on public money, on public funds, on taxpayers, German taxpayers' money. And the concern is, okay, you bring with your projects not only in South Korea but in North Korea as well, you bring public money there. So what is the purpose of that? Do you do something, or I mean, is it to stabilize the regime? So should that be supported? And from our position is quite clear. We should do that. This is the economic dimension of this trust policy. Let's have a look to the German case. So back to the 17th, the history of German division has shown that economic cooperation can slowly build up trust and change attitudes. Of course, international investors will be far more reluctant to invest in North Korea than they have been to invest in Eastern Europe. What we as the Naumann Foundation did in August, when I was in Pyongyang last visit to Pyongyang, we brought an expert from Eastern Germany, so from the former GDR, from the state of Saxony. So you know, 16 states in Germany. From the state of Saxony, which is a so-called new state in Eastern Germany with Dresden and Leipzig, very famous cities. And this state is doing a quite good job when it comes to economic and education, by the way. So we brought this expert for fostering the regional economy to Pyongyang. He gave lectures there to representatives of ministries, of several ministries, because we offer them, we ask them, are you interested in having someone who knows how to transform a formerly socialistic planning economy into a free market system? And they accepted. So we were with that expert from Dresden in Saxony in Pyongyang. So come back to the question, we as a foundation, or we in general, definitely have to be aware that economic cooperation will only have a sustaining political impact if it is provided reliable on a long-term basis and not utilized for short-term gains such as business profits or political concessions. Let me come back once again to the German case. In Germany, economic cooperation was part of a bigger concept. I already mentioned that. Ostpolitik goes back to the 60s, 70s. Ostpolitik, which was aimed to reconciling West Germany with Russia, or then Soviet Union, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the former GDR, Eastern Germany. It rendered the separation of our country more bearable, but the long-distance goal remained unification. Only after East and West Germany had mutually recognized sovereign equality and legal legitimacy, in 1972, the bilateral relations improved and cooperation on practical matters began in earnest. Only then could mutual trust and dependency be built up. So furthermore, I think this is well known, the central role Western Germany played in the regional economic integration of Europe in the Conference of Cooperation and Development in Europe, so Helsinki Agreement, and in the security architecture of NATO, made unification acceptable to its neighbor. Probably one remark, I mean, this is different compared to the situation here in Eastern Asia. Germany was or is responsible for the Second World War. So Germany was divided, like Korea is divided, but Germany was not a victim from a historical point of view. So, and this is a different situation, and a lot of German intellectuals, they thought, okay, the separation was the penalty for the one last minute, was the result of the Second World War. So let me come to an end. Although the international political framework is markedly different in East Asia, South Korea can profit, from my point of view, from investing in international trust building too. Responsible Korea, actively promoting regional cooperation and integration, will acquire political goodwill abroad and support for reunification in the future. That's why the fact that the Park administration seeks to build a higher level of cooperation on and around the Korean Peninsula through trust politics makes sense. Issues like the environment and disaster relief required cooperation across all countries, including North Korea. Talks about these things can help for foster trust. My institution, the Naumann Foundation, I already said it, aims to help building trust through capacity building and knowledge sharing with North Korea on various issues. And last remark, we are willing to share, we as a Naumann Foundation, the experience with trust building Germany gained during the Cold War and support peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. We sincerely hoped that trust policy will contribute to eventually achieve a peacefully united Korea in a stable and prosperous East Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Richter. Actually, there's a point you raised on this second part about this regional context, the relation among the countries in and around the Korean Peninsula requires special attention. So on that respect, I'd like to have some response from Professor Kang about the U.S. position in improving the relations with North Korea, and also the Ambassador Togo's comments. Maybe I'm sure that you will be responding to the points he raised. But actually, Mr. Chon, I'd like to ask what is your take on your understanding the relations between trust building process and Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative? It seems to me that those are relatively independent from each other, because actually we are talking about totally different topics in one aspect and another. So I'd like to have your response on the interconnectedness, or maybe this Dr. Richter's recommendation. We have to think about greater regional context, which will promote inter-Korean the context and enhance the inter-Korean cooperation in the coming years. Now, last but least, I'd like to have Ambassador Togo points on this trust politic.
Thank you very much. I first of all would like to thank the organization to have invited me and to have made this excellent presentation. I assume that most of you is aware about the website of Asan. A few days ago, Sheila Smith wrote an article entitled North Korea in Japan's Strategic Thinking. North Korea in Japan's Strategic Thinking. This is such well-written article that I can almost end my presentation here. And secondly, today, to my amazement, I see Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan, Mr. Sugiyama, who is sitting over there, with whom I have worked very closely in my foreign ministry days, and who is actually responsible for running Japanese foreign policy in East Asia. So what I'm going to say is exclusively my own personal view, which I think will differ from what Sugiyama-san will say. Sugiyama-san doesn't need to comment on my points. But toward the end of my presentation, I have two questions to Sugiyama-san. And I hope that the chairman will allow him to respond. Now, about Japan's policy towards North Korea. As I said, my view greatly overlaps with Sheila's view, but I would like to summarize it in 3 points. First, in 2002, Prime Minister Koizumi visited North Korea with an unusual strategic thinking and succeeded in achieving a kind of breakthrough. But ironically, he succeeded in revealing some truths of abduction issue and revealed and free some of the abductees then. But that has ignited Japan's national emotion, and since then, Japan's policy towards North Korea was hijacked by abduction issue. And the only success we had since then was to liberate families of the 5 abductees, but no further concrete result anymore. And second, how it was reflected in six-party talks. To my understanding, Japan took the most rigorous position in six-party talks. And we have implemented several economic sanctions on and on. And so when the United States had a tough policy on North Korea, we relatively felt ourselves comfortable. But when the United States were more in the direction of negotiations, there emerged certain discomfort on our part. But as Sheila points out, in all, my observation is that Japan's role in participating in determining the future of the peninsula, Japan became marginalized. Now, thirdly, about the domestic implication. When this key policy shift from a holistic strategic approach to North Korea changed into sort of fixation on abduction policy, Abe Shinzo was occupying the position of Deputy Cabinet Secretary. And in fact, in the Japanese domestic politics, it is his tough policy which gained his popularity, which eventually paved the way for his prime ministership in 2006. So when Abe came back at the end of last year, the general anticipation was that North Korea policy will be the least flexible that we can expect from Abe, given this domestic situation. So in that context, the fact that Mr. Iijima was the closest aide to former Prime Minister Koizumi, and now an advisor to Abe, visited North Korea in May and seemingly tried to take some flexible approach. That was a bit surprising. But judging from all the reports which came out afterwards, that visit did not seem to have bear any fruit. And clearly, to my perception, there is nothing which tells us that Abe is prepared to go beyond strategic approach than his efforts to try to resolve the abduction issue. Now, all these points, I think, are well shared by most of the participants. And so I have not added much. But if we see the North Korean issue through the prism of South Korea or South Korea-Japan relations, I have a lot to say. And this connotates to what, where has gone John? John mentioned this morning about the greater strategic implication of Japan's policy in Northeast Asia. And so let me run down very, very quickly. At this point in time, Japan's strategic position in Northeast Asia is very simple. We have one issue which is creating, in my wording, some existential threat, and that comes from China. So priority number one policy for Japan is China. And there are clearly two aspects on it. One is deterrence, and another one is dialogue. Some aspects of increasing deterrence is inevitable, but I hasten to add that dialogue should follow. And in that point, from that perspective, I think Abe is doing reasonably well. At least the atmospherics of dialogue between Japan and China is changing. Emphasis on economic cooperation is emerging. We have not still reached to the point of overcoming present-day difficulty, but I think Abe is doing reasonably well. And the second bunch of policies for Japan is to create good, trustworthy relations with all neighboring countries, That is not the same as encircling China, not at all. But the point is that with the view of this challenge, it is natural that we seek for stronger relations with neighboring countries. And who are our neighboring countries? First, United States. And despite several difficult issues, I think, and despite some irritation caused by sort of Abe's revisionism, I think on the whole, our relations with the United States is sound. And secondly, there's Russia. And for those who have dealt with Russia many years, who earned certain breakthrough on the relationship, the outcome might be a little desired, but I'm sure Sugiyama-san and others are doing its best to find some kind of breakthrough, particularly starting from April this year. And then there's ASEAN, and Abe just finished his last visit to the 10th ASEAN countries, which is a commendable effort, and this follows Mongolia, India, Australia, and so forth. But where is Korea? Where is Korea? In my counting, Korea should come next to the United States. But the relations with Korea at this point is that the atmospherics is so bad, so bad. And from Japan's perspective, at least from my perspective, it is somewhat puzzling. Japan came a long way in the 68 years after the war. After the end of the war, Japan went through a long process of recognizing Korean Han curse, and Japan accepted, in my view, as a basis of the post-war reconstruction of the relationship. Then, particularly in the last 10 years or so, we came to realize, or we came to be fascinated by the strength of democracy of Korea, and we began to admire the economic strength, and lastly the Korean cultural wave. So at the time when Japan was realizing the greatness of Korea, something is not going on well. In my view, there are 4 issues: relations between the top leaders, comfort woman, Takeshima Senkaku, and the issue of the Korean judicial decision on forced labor, which is creating some vicious cycle. And what we need is to cut off this cycle, cut off these 4 factors and improve one by one, so that we are going to create a positive cycle. Now, I hope that we can do this. But enough for Japan-South Korean relations. I want to conclude with Japan's relations with North Korea. And so here comes my question to Sugiyama-san. Is there not a way to use Japan-North Korean relations, or to do something more positive on Japan-North Korea relations with a view to strengthen Japan-South Korea relations? Cannot the Japanese government see with greater interest and in a more positive light President Park's trust-building process on the Korean Peninsula? Its key element is sustainable peace on the Korean Peninsula. Cannot Japan give greater approval to a multifaceted approach for dialogue and acknowledge the Korea-China-US dialogue, which has some historical justification, since these were the participants in the armistice in the Korean War together with North Korea? Can Japan not view in a more positive light party's initiative called ROK Solid Defense, or as Professor Lee Chun-min described, maintaining South Korea's firm non-nuclear posture while upgrading Seoul's ability to launch credible preemptive strikes against the North, if wanted, looms as a major strategic task for the Park administration. These discussions should lead to the serious issue of what can Japan contribute toward realizing Korean denuclearization, which at the same time might create a bridge to meaningful talks with South Korea. In conclusion, cannot the Japanese administration think in a more long-term and strategic manner about the Korean Peninsula? As a matter of fact, there is only one issue of real strategic importance, that is normalization with North Korea. Is it in Japan's interest to do it vis-à-vis North Korea before the unification, or deal with the united Korea in resolving all pre-war related issues which have remained unresolved in North Korean days? In tackling this strategic agenda it goes without saying that Japan's policy should be closely coordinated with South Korea and the United States. Precisely, the coordination with South Korea on Japan's reconceptualization of its relations with North Korea might create another important bridge between Japan and South Korea. Sorry to speak long.
Thank you. That's exactly the point I was going to raise. What is your position on trilateral cooperation in dealing with North Korea? I don't know whether it's proper to have Ambassador Sugiyama for his comments, but I will come back later because actually we have some questions posed by each other. So maybe let me start with Professor David Kang on your thought on this, the questions I posed and the comments you got from the other participants, please.
Okay. Sure, I'll be very brief, which is, again, since I clearly do not speak for the U.S. government, yeah, I'm totally in favor of regime change. I think most of us are. I would love to see the North Korean regime disappear. The difference is, though, that I don't advocate using force doing it. And whether or not, I mean, you know, the thing is, whether I want or not, I'm gonna have very little influence on the outcome. And so I think the best way to change, even if the regime isn't gonna change, much can change about the country as well. But absolutely, right? I mean, you know, in the long run. One last short point on sort of U.S.-China cooperation, or my view on China's approach is, I think they're willing to do marginal, sort of formulaic attempts to add pressure. But on the whole, I see a real attempt to 40-year mining agreements with North Korea. I see a lot of attempt for trying to get North Korea still to do the sort of China model of reform. What does John Park call it? An engagement strategy with Chinese characteristics. And I don't see any fundamental change, despite a lot of rhetoric to that aspect. So I think they're still basically looking to engage North Korea.
Okay. But maybe, Professor Chu Shui-Leong, you can respond on this, the David Kang's point. Maybe China has not changed its policy vis-a-vis North Korea.
To North Korea.
Yeah, to North Korea, fundamentally.
Yeah, agree. Overall policy to keep a closer relation, try to have North Korea. That policy has not changed over the 60 years. But on nuclear issue, missile issues, and on North Korea provocative action against South Korea, China policy has changed. Chinese leaders, including President, Chinese government clear publicly attack, criticize like those behaviors. So I think that change. And attitude, Chinese people, including we scholars, news media, internet, officials, leaders, attitude towards North Korea has changed. There's not any friend feeling towards North Korea. Increasing regard North Korea as a rough state, as an evil state even to some people. I think that mindset has changed.
Okay, I think Mr. Chong, you have lots of questions, so maybe we need to take some time. Right now you can respond back to the questions. Okay.
네. 아까 주박사님이 이제
Well, thank you very much. Earlier on, Dr. Kang has talked about the sanctions against North Korea. Che Kang talked about the sanctions against North Korea, and also coerce and pressure, as well as the balance between coerce and pressure, as well as incentives. First of all, regarding the sanctions against North Korea, there were a lot of speculations, but what I can tell you at the moment regarding the May 24th measures, as well as other sanctions against North Korea, well, we are not reviewing the possibilities of lifting those sanctions at the moment. But on need basis, for example, including the Najin Asan project MOU, as long as certain projects are in favor of our country's benefits, that I believe is a very special occasion or special case, considering the development of the relationship between Korea and Russia. And so at the moment, we are not in a position to review the possibilities of lifting sanctions against North Korea. We're not seeing major changes that would necessitate those changes. But that said, that's our basic stand. But that said, our doors for dialogues are open, and when more flexible approaches would become more necessary, then we will take measures accordingly. As was mentioned earlier on, striking a balance between different elements, I believe, is one of the critical tasks that are ahead of us. And beginning this year, from different perspectives, the Korean government has been taking various measures from different perspectives. And I believe that there are the opinions that are supporting or against those measures. But our efforts has been always on the foundation of seeking and striking balance. But I'm not saying that we're in the middle way or in the median point. But depending upon the developments of the situation, we're making our utmost efforts to strike a very flexible and healthy balance. Also, Professor Chusuro and Dr. Miheyev have mentioned earlier on, in order to build trust, socio as well as economic, socio as well as cultural approaches would be important, and both professors have emphasized the importance of those approaches. And also Professor Kang has mentioned the importance of long-term approaches, as well as the importance of seeking continuous engagement for North Korean people. We will take all that into account, and I thank you very much for your valuable contributions. So those will help us a lot in forging our policies in the future. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chan. I think he responded in a very
questions posed
diplomatic
upon him. So now I'd like to open the floor. So if there are any questions, please identify yourself and very brief in your question or comments. So if Ambassador, would you like to respond back to the question posed by your senior? Okay, please.
My name is Sugiyama. I'm Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, but I'm here not as Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs, but simply I have been involved in this great KGF for over the past 4 years. It's something I have been a kind of an original member of this great forum. Though this is my second time, because last couple of years when I was the Director General for Asia and Pacific region, I was really a responsible officer in terms of Sino-Japan or Korea-Japan or DPLK Japan. And maybe some of you might remember that I represented my government when we were able to resume government-to-government talks with DPLK with my opposite number from Pyongyang in Ulaanbaatar about a year ago or so, which we hoped was going on, but due to missile launch and followed by the nuclear detonation, that was not stopped, but that was postponed, and it is still postponed. But anyway, responding to Ambassador Togo's questions or orders or instructions, whatever you might say, because he's my senior, I used to work for him half a dozen times or something, so I have to follow his instructions. But simply to say first that my answer, although I'm here not as an official representative of the Japanese government, but with my title of being Deputy Minister with cameras in front of public, only first thing is that I wish I could be as free as Ambassador Togo to speak up freely, but I don't think I can.
Yep.
I have to be careful. That said, what I can say as a person is that, of course, no one denies the very fact that Sino-Japan or Korea-Japan, we do have tensions, and we do have something to overcome. And yet, presumably over the past 16 months or 18 months or something, on this particular question relating to DPLK, not only Korea, Japan, ROK, Japan, and USA, but also China, of course, together with Russians, Mr. Molgrove was my opposite number in relation to dealing with DPRK, and now he's my opposite number in relation to peace treaty negotiations. What I try to say is that when it comes to DPRK, we all together seem to have something much more in common because of some dangerous kind of postures being shown by the third generation regime. It seems to have stopped somewhat since this summer, but all in all, the situation hasn't been changed. Mind you, as Chairperson pointed out, that Cheonan incident or Yeonpyeongdo incident haven't been solved, although United Nations Security Council did issue some presidential statement on one of the two. The other one,
No.
they didn't even issue the PRST. So presumably for the South Koreans, you guys have to deal with this. For us too. I have to a certain degree, sorry to rebut Ambassador Togo as my senior. On China, yes, indeed, we have tensions. But the government has never said China as a threat. Even at the Cold War time, we never did say Soviet Union was a direct threat. We said Soviet Union was a potential threat. And yet, we have been saying DPRK has been giving us a direct threat, and the threat seems to be increasing. Because of that, I think we do share something more common, not only among ROK, Japan, and USA, but these days together with China and Russia. And these days, I'm quite certain that people like Ambassador Udaiwei and others seem to be more proactive and trying to persuade or trying to coerce, or both, Pyongyang. We'll see how China and we, Russians and Americans, and of course ROK, as a kind of, the main player, can do something better. So that's something which, as a person, not necessarily representing my government, I can say in front of the audience this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I really appreciate your braveness. It's because I think because of your senior diplomat forced you to, not me. So please take my apology for mismanaging that. And also, Peter.
Peter Beck from the Asia Foundation. Ambassador Togo, it's great to see you here in Seoul. I have a couple of questions for you. I think you correctly identified the four main contentious issues between Korea, Japan, and you rightfully described it that we're in a vicious cycle right now and that we need to break out of it, but you didn't tell us how we could break out of this vicious cycle. So I was wondering, how can we break out of this cycle? And my second question is, the Korean media put a lot of focus, in fact, it was front page news last week when a group of retired scholars and diplomats presented a declaration that they signed to the Japanese government last week, saying that it was important to place more emphasis on improving relations with Korea. I was wondering, how was that covered in Japan, and if you could explain to us your decision whether you joined this group or didn't join this group.
Okay, Ambassador?
May I?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, sorry. Well, I don't think I need spend too much time on Japan, South Korea, but nevertheless I said it. And so very, very briefly, comfort woman. I said there are four issues. Separate it and do maximum on each. That was my recipe. So on comfort woman, well, now it is reported that by the end of the Noda administration, the two sides came up already with some kind of resolution. And for 1 year, it is simply not followed.
But by the way, as a chairperson, I have to say this is about the Korean Peninsula, but not on Japan. Yeah. So very brief on
that. Yeah, okay. And Takeshima doctor, if one want to resolve it, it's impossible. But there is a way to coexist with it. And third, the Korean judiciary decision on enforced labor. At this point, this is most difficult. But the two sides should get together and squeeze their brain to do something. And lastly, the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President. Well, yeah, I mean, some courage is needed.
Okay, it seems to me that what we need right now is like a creation, the situation where all we can work together in solving the North Korean problem. For example, the bilateration between Korea and Japan may be further enhanced by focusing North Korea only, and also we should put aside some issues away for the time being and while we are focusing on North Korea. On that respect, I have a question about Japanese perspective on U.S.-Korea-China collaboration North Korean issue. What is your response on that? And the other way around, what is the Chinese response on trilateral cooperation, U.S., Korea, Japan? We used to have a TCOG meetings, and TCOG was the execution body for carrying out the Perry process. So what is the Chinese thinking, or what is the Chinese take on that?
Well,
Please,
what I mentioned in my initial presentation, that if my understanding is correct, the four parties in relation to the armistice is North Korea, South Korea, China, and the United States. So I am not that sensitive that these four parties will get together. And I wanted to support President Park's idea of this multifaceted, multi-layered consultations.
Okay.
But that's my personal view.
Thank you. Professor Chu?
A couple of years ago, when I was a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, I proposed a trilateral strategic dialogue among China, US, Japan on regional issues, including North Korea. And the 2 or 3 policy planning directors of the 3 foreign ministry did have a trilateral meeting a year ago, but they stopped because situation. But I think on North Korea, I would like to suggest that perhaps it's more important for ROK, US, China, to have a trilateral talk, if we want to have a trilateral talk. Because I think it's very much relevant to North Korea. But I think Japan is less relevant to on North Korea issue. They do not even have diplomatic relations.
Okay. So, and then I can take more questions from the floor. This is the difficult moment for chairperson to manage this session. But let me ask you some questions to my dear friend Chan Ha-sung. So actually, with President Park Geun-hye's policy on North Korea has been the highest, the appreciated, the policy. Public support for that is quite high. So because actually, in principle, the approach is a bit the one. So on the other hand, in the political circle, there are some debates, emerging debates. So what would be your idea in consolidating or strengthening the domestic consensus? Because actually, for example, in providing the vision for Korea and also providing for vision the other neighboring countries, can you be a little bit specific on the what is the small unification, when you mean the small unification?
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very important as well as a very pertinent question. Regarding the implementation of North Korean policies as well as reunification policies, our trust building together with North Korea was the focus of my talk today. One of the important elements of the trust building process would be that even prior to the trust building with North Korea, it's very critical that we earn trust from the Korean people and the public. I think that's a very critical point for the successful implementation of the policies. And so on that front, as Dr. Che has mentioned earlier on, the implementation of the Park Geun-hye's North Korean policies has been receiving good support and solid support from the Korean public as far as I understand. But at the same time, the threats and provocation of North Korea have been meeting the very stern responses, and we have been also taking very flexible approaches as well. I think that kind of consoled and created a comfortable sentiment about the government policies towards North Korea amongst the Korean population. And recently, continuously, the efforts are being made, and there is a voice that is requesting more continuous efforts towards the government to create a closer relationship with North Korea. And also Minister Liu in the talk in the morning has mentioned that we will start to see some results from next year as well. So more visible results are being requested at the moment by some. So we're taking all those into consideration, and we're now reviewing various approaches to see more visible results in the coming years. Another level is to build confidence and deepen collaboration with the international community. I believe trust building with North Korea would be also contingent upon the trust building with the international community. However, unfortunately, we do not have, so to speak, trust between inter-Korean relation or between North and South Korea, although we're continuously making efforts. We still have a long way to go before we're able to establish good trust. Whether it would be North Korean nuclear issue or issues around other fronts, I believe that trust building can be facilitated further if we also deepen our trust and collaboration with the international community. For example, normalization of the Kaesong industrial complex would be also dealt with from an international perspective as well. And North Korean nuclear issue is also being discussed with our close cooperation with our allies and adjacent countries. And also economic cooperation between North and South needs to be addressed and conducted in a more international framework. These are some of the top-of-mind ideas that in the current government at the moment. So in other words, international cooperation will be a good driving force to induce changes in North Korea and deepen the cooperation with North Korea.
Now,
Mr. Chairman,
okay.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Okay,
to Mr.
sure.
Yes. Very short question. What makes you have trust that North Korea will not close the Kaesong industrial complex next time?
Okay, while he's thinking, I like to have Scott's final question.
Thanks. You touched on this in your answer, but basically it seems like the North Koreans mistrust trust politique. And I want to know if you think it's because they don't understand it well enough, or is there some other obstacle internal to North Korea that is preventing them from being comfortable with this concept?
So your understanding on North Korea's perception of trust politic. Okay.
네.
Okay, Dr. Snyder mentioned earlier that our trust building process or North Korean policy is yet to receive the full frontal trust from North Korea. Yes, I do agree with that. I am not very optimistic that we will get that anytime soon, despite the fact that we will maintain our consistent message towards North Korea. We will send the same and consistent message toward the North, whether that be from our minister or from the national president or the high-ranking officials that is dealing with North Korea. We have been very consistent in sending the message that we want to build a trust relationship, whether that be through humanitarian assistance and aid and the normalization of the Kaesong industrial complex. So I believe that what is important for us to do going forward is to send a consistent message and make a consistent effort. So that is why we believe that the highest priority is to maintain the policy consistency. And I am saying this over and over again, that this efforts will be appreciated by North Korea, and we would love that to be reciprocated with the right decision from the North Korea. About the Kaesong industrial complex, and we reached an agreement in August, and it reopened in September. And some kind, we made a we stressed over and over again that something that happened last March should not happen again. And well, it should be something more significant than such an agreement between these two officials from the two sides. But it should come as an outcome of the continuous conversation and discussion from those two sides, and we'd like to make some more tangible achievement through encouraging North Korea to be a part of the international standards and norms, so that the Kaesong Industrial Complex will not be closed down any further. So we want to have a number of safety measures in place that can prevent the Kaesong Industrial Complex from closing down any further. So in those aspects, I believe that sending the same message from neighboring countries is also very important, because in North Korea within, there is an increased emphasis on economic development and reforms and economic cooperation with the Chinese authorities.
I think that we have covered quite a wide range of issues, but actually one comment says it should be rather long-term approach, incremental, step-by-step, but rather comprehensive, not just only focusing on the security, but also the other areas, cultural exchange, social exchange program. Second, it requires multilateral cooperation and coordination among all concerned parties. Six-party talks, or maybe EU can play significant role, kinds of things. And furthermore, there should be a kind of common vision at the where we want to be at some time in the future. Maybe that could be the unification or peaceful unification, and also. But actually, we try to serve the individual's happiness at the end. So please join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent presentation and response.
And thanking Mr. Chair.